And we are live.
Hi,
Awesome.
everyone. Welcome to the show, Conscious Living Radio, recording on Facebook right now. And then, of course, goes live on FM on Wednesday night, 6 to 7 p.m. Co op radio here in Vancouver, 100.5 FM. And also on your YouTube channel there, Marc, right?
Yes,
Conscious Living Network.
you got it. It's just keeping up with the changing times. It was time to do things different when they shut down the station, which I think might be opening up soon as the restrictions are being lifted here in British Columbia. So I'm excited to see when we can go back into the station and broadcast live on air. Will be an
I
exciting
know.
time.
It
So,
will be.
yeah.
So today we're talking about developing your personal action plan for achieving radical justice through allyship and solidarity. My guest is Reverend Dereca Blackmon, a passionate speaker, activist, national expert on topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Consulting for over 25 years with corporate, educational, nonprofit, and community-based groups to facilitate uncommon conversations on issues of race, gender, class, social justice. She also taught intergroup communication at Stanford University, and her work has been featured on CNN, Wall Street Journal, New York Times. She co-led the effort to organize the Bay Area community response to the murder of Oscar Grant by transit police. And after mobilizing thousands of protesters and rallies, she began to question the strategy of organizing against rather than for. She entered ministerial school and has become one of the nation's leading speakers on spiritual activism. Welcome to the show. I so appreciate you joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It is my pleasure to be here.
So you've been an activist for a long time. I'm really curious what guided you to ministerial school and broadening your activism to include your spirituality.
Yeah, it's interesting. I got the call to ministerial school 14 years, or to ministry 14 years before I actually entered ministerial school because I didn't really see myself as that type of leader. I thought, oh, how could I be a minister? I'm way too secular in my thinking and in my world. And I had been involved in activism since I was an undergraduate at Stanford. I was really involved in the movement for ethnic studies. I had done political organizing and voter registration back in 2004. And I had led nonprofit organizations, mostly serving underserved youth, youth in crisis and trauma, sexually exploited minors, and folks in juvenile detention. And then when I left that work, right after I left, 6 months after I left my executive director position, Oscar Grant was killed in Oakland by the transit police, as you said. And it deeply impacted me, first as a mother, but also as a community organizer and activist and someone who had been working with Black youth in Oakland for almost a decade at that point. And I met his family and just got really involved in organizing with some of the people I had been working with in youth development in the Bay Area for quite a while. And in the middle of that movement, we had a lot of deep and powerful conversations about the role of spirituality in activism. And at that point, I wasn't yet a minister, but I was already a community leader in my church, and which is a Centers for Spiritual Living Church, if you're familiar with that philosophy. And um, there was a moment where some of the folks I was involved in the protesting um, in another group threw red paint on the woman who was the leader of the BART board, the transit board at the time. And they threw the paint on her and they said, "The blood is on your hands." And I just had a moment where I was just really clear that wasn't a tactic I was willing to use. And I wanted to be not just unapologetically for justice, but unapologetically spiritual in my approach. So I decided to go to ministerial school because I wanted you to know that if you called me to come to a rally, that I would absolutely show up, but that I would pray and that I would speak from a place of, the ultimate goal being love and justice. And that is not at all to condemn anger, because I think anger is an important spark and a tool. And I'm sure we'll get into that more in this
Mhm.
conversation. But when I got to ministerial school, it just became clear I wanted that to be, I want it to be unapologetically spiritual. And so what I practice now, I call spiritual activism, which is just that integration that I talked about, that I'm always going to talk about the ultimate goal of love and justice, even as I protest or whatever actions I'm involved in around really just holding people accountable. And I see those things as integral and important.
And so if you were to define spiritual activism and compare it to activism, what is that key ingredient? What is the difference between the two?
I think that it's like I said, it's about what you're focused on, right? There's sometimes a focus on what we're against rather
Mm-hmm.
than what we're for.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's a spectrum, right? So I'll jump into this. It's something that I teach in my courses and then I've talked about. My mentor, Reverend Deborah Johnson, talks about the fire triangle. And a fire needs three elements. It needs heat, it needs fuel, and it needs oxygen. And the way she talks about this is that we can't shirk away from any of those aspects. So that anger, that protest, that activism, Dr. King talked about it so much. We shouldn't enter this moment to castigate or condemn or even criticize people who are expressing anger for injustice. They should be expressing anger for injustice. We all should be
Are we
angry
all?
about injustice. If you're not angry, you're not paying attention. But that's not going to sustain a fire by itself. You have to have that heat, that spark that gets people's attention, but you need fuel, right? What are we doing to sustain? This is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And that fuel can be our service, it can be the money we put into the movement, it could be our time, it could be our self-care. All of those things are necessary to sustain this work, but the spirituality is that oxygen. Van Jones liked to say, Dr. King had a dream, not a complaint.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't just want people to get off the back of the bus. He wanted Black children and white children holding hands. He was unafraid to march, and he was extremely unpopular at the time of his death. We love to revere people now after they're gone, but he was very unpopular in the spiritual establishment. The letter from the Birmingham jail was about the fact that ministers had attacked him for being too radical. So it's okay to be too radical. It just needs we need to be able to tell people in service to what.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned anger, and there are so many people who, well-intentioned people perhaps, but they're unconscious, maybe even offensive. They just don't get it. They keep saying, I'm not a racist, but I'm not a racist, as if it's just a personal issue.
Mhm.
And they do get hit often, or certainly it has been what's been occurring quite a bit is hit with this anger. And cancel culture is as a result as well. And so I think those people, I'm not sure that it's helping them understand systemic racism. It seems to be creating a reactivity for the reaction. Do you know what I mean? So you've got two reactive elements. In other words, it's polarizing. I wonder if you could speak to that and what could help people. I almost want to say, receive the anger, understand why it's there, first of all, and then what would a response be? Because I don't think you're asking people to just lie down and be shamed,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, a couple thoughts about that. One, I want to be really clear. It's not the response that's polarizing, it's the oppression. The anger isn't the polarizing thing, it's the injustice, right? So what's polarizing is years of racism and white supremacy and police brutality. That's been polarizing.
Mm-hmm.
What's happening is we're just becoming aware of how polarizing it's been, because I say all the time, if you have Mr. Friendly who got the cat out of the tree and gave your kids a ride home from hockey practice, you have no idea why people are so angry. And one of the things that's most hurtful is when people say they never realized, or they were so shocked or so surprised, because the only way you could not realize is to have willfully not been paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
Because this conversation has been happening since the sheriff was leading the lynching posse, since it was Emmett Till, since it was Rodney King. It's been happening, and that's what polarizes. So we can't focus on the response that people have after hundreds of years of police brutality. The original police were slave patrols, right? So I always ask people, what is your solution? And how much have you been involved in the solution? You're saying anger is not the solution, but how involved have you been in any solution? So you can't show up to the problem with the critique of the response, right? So that's the first thing. But I also think you're right. We do need to figure out a way to bridge these divides, right? And I think, though, the responsibility actually lies on the folks who have the privilege to be able to have those conversations. I also think we focus a little bit too much on the toughest nuts to crack. Whenever I do workshops and classes, people always ask me, how do I talk to those people? How do I talk to them, those people? And the problem is a conversation involves two people listening. And if you don't want to listen to them, you're probably not the right person to talk to them. And we don't have to focus on that because the movement for Black Lives was the biggest movement in history. And so what we have is hundreds of thousands, millions of people around the world who want to have change, who want to be allies. And if we spent a little bit less time focusing on how to change other people's minds, we actually could move the ground around them by actually sustaining our fuel with spending more time with like-minded people, thinking about what can we build? What can we build with the hundreds of thousands of people who want to make change? They're frustrated on both sides because one side is frustrated because they don't know what to do. They want to make a difference. They're committed. That's the side I'm most interested in. That's who the class is for, is the people who do get it, but still aren't sure what to do, right? And we focus too much on the people who don't get it. Because it's never, what did Margaret Mead say? It just takes a few small group of committed folks, right? That's really all it takes. And we have hundreds of thousands of committed folks. Let's focus on that.
Right. And you mentioned creating something. It is important, don't you think, to also look at what needs to be dissolved, what isn't working, and actually taking steps, not just talking, but actually doing something.
Yeah, I mean, people don't always like my answer. I will say the first thing that I usually say is we have to turn off the television and the squawk radio. So, my grandmother, recently, I've been spending time with her and just looking at her care as an elder. And one of the things that I noticed is that she constantly had the so-called television news on all day, every day and night. And it really is the same story in different iterations over and over and over again. And it's all about divide. And I don't care which channel you're watching, it's all about divide. And people are watching this 24 hours a day. They're listening into it in their car. It's all they do. And so, of course, this exacerbates whatever tension and friction we have, because again, we're all focused on what the other side, so to speak, is doing or not doing, or how we're being attacked, oppressed, how stupid they are. And when you talk to people, that's the thing they're so angry about. I'm tired of being treated like I'm stupid, like I'm uninformed, right? People are angry about that. And it's just a misapplication of time and resources to focus so much on that. And so this is why Conscious Living Radio and so many things like this are important, because we need more conversation about what we're for. We need more conversation about what we can do, and less conversation about who doesn't agree with us. So if you want to change something today, you have to turn that off sometimes. I'm not saying you can never look at it, but let's be honest, it's not news. Very rarely are we getting, it's mostly opinion, right? So that's my first thing. What needs to be dissolved is this like stream that is constantly going into our minds that there's a whole group of people that are against us.
Right. And so what defines being an ally? Let's get right into it. What does solidarity actually look like?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I taught solidarity and racial justice for a few years at Stanford, and when the class first started, it was called Allyship. And the students, who are always sort of on the vanguard of the concepts we need to be talking about, they pushed back. This was 4 or 5 years ago on the title Allyship. And one of the conversations people are having is that we should talk about ally as a verb, not a noun, because I think we're so desperate for some sense of validation that we're not bad people in
Mm,
this work. We really
mhm.
want someone to say, "Hey, I'm one of the good ones. I'm one of the dedicated ones. I really am on your side." And so that's what people want ally to be, but that oversimplifies what needs to be done. The work of allyship, if you think of that as the verb, or being an ally as the verb, what the work that needs to be done is as deep and complex as the experience of people who are oppressed and marginalized, right? You can't simplify the identity of ally or activist, right? The A word, I like to call activist the A word, because to me, we all should be active, right? What is
Mhm.
the alternative to be passive, right? That's just
Right.
Peggy McIntosh says, oppression is a conveyor belt. It is happening. And if you do nothing, you're just going along with it. There is no nothing to do now. That's the status quo and maintaining it. We all have to take action. So I think allyship in its best form is really about being willing to do the self exploration, the self education, like going out, taking the courses, watching the videos. People are saying, I don't know what to do, but there's so many people in the business of education right now. There's videos, there's books, there's podcasts, there's shows like this. There's so many places where you can get educated. And that's one of the reasons why I'm teaching this course, is so that people can kind of figure out what is their pathway to
Mhm,
action. What is my
mhm,
personal, because it's not going to be the same for everyone.
mhm.
Somebody's going to be the like I said, the heat, somebody's going to be the fuel, somebody's going to be the oxygen, and there's 1,000 pathways within that. So I think it's that. And then I think at the highest level, it's when you take the courage to educate other people, right? That's at the highest level, when you start to interrupt prejudice and discrimination when you see it, right? We have a expression at my company, Inclusion Design Group. We talk about an inclusive mindset, and you'll see it here on my image. It's be brave, be humble, and be dedicated, right? And brave enough to make mistakes. If you're not making mistakes, you're not being brave enough. If you're not getting canceled or offending someone, I get canceled all the time. I have privilege of being cisgendered or able-bodied or any of those things. I get canceled all the time. We have to have a thicker skin about that, right?
Mhm.
Folks are dealing with injustice. So brave enough to make mistakes, humble enough to admit you made the mistakes and continue educating yourself, and dedicated enough to keep going after you've been canceled, called out,
Right.
all of the things.
Are you going to be looking at that in the workshop, white fragility, and that finding ways to actually get a thicker skin? It's easy to say, but how do you do that, you know?
I think one of the things we have to do is start talking about our mistakes.
Mm,
So I talk a lot about, in my 5 years at Stanford, I had 4 trans staff people in my 5 years. And I talk a lot about how little I knew about trans folks or non-binary folks. I taught classes and I had non-binary students in my classes. I knew nothing about those issues. I committed so many microaggressions and macro assaults. And instead of always shirking away and trying to pretend like if we're good, we're perfect, we have to
mhm,
talk about
mhm.
the mistakes that we make, so other people will realize that mistakes are a part of the process. We have to surround ourselves with other people who are on the journey with us, right? Who we can go to and say, oh my gosh, I made this horrible mistake, right? Who are
Right.
on the journey with us. And if we're blessed enough to have people from that identity who are in our inner circle, we call that reverse mentoring, right? If you have that, that's an incredible blessing. But even if you don't, like I said, there's classes, communities. I think it's just really all of us admitting that we make mistakes. This,
I love that. I
yeah,
love that because and I was going to ask you how you're marrying this as a pathway. It almost sounds like, learning that you're human and we're all human. We all make mistakes. That's part of a spiritual awakening too, because
yes,
then you no longer judge yourself or others. You actually start to accept and come back to love, like in just your way of being.
yes,
And at the same time, I'm acutely aware that sometimes the most supposed spiritual people are the ones who are not understanding their privilege, not understanding systemic racism at all. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I think part of it is the idea we've been taught historically that good people are colorblind. We've been taught historically that if it's racist to talk about race, right? We've been taught historically that our only thing is oneness, right? And Ernest Holmes, who's the founder of the Science of Mind, talks about the multiplicity in oneness, right? So diversity is a celebration of the incredible richness of oneness, right? And I tell people are like, oh, we shouldn't be focused on the problem. We shouldn't talk about racism. No one says that about the environment. No one says, oh, we should ignore the damage that's being done and just hold a high consciousness about the environment. No, they say we need to recycle, we need to reduce carbon emissions. If I believe that racism is a disease and we should be willing to address it like any other disease. And you cannot address what you cannot face. But the problem here is the idea of blame and shame. And people are so focused on feeling guilty, even the people who get it, and they're just paralyzed by guilt. Guilt is useless. It's not getting us anywhere. It's not moving us forward. So I really feel the responsibility in this moment is on the people who get it, the people who are dedicated to actually model what it looks like to be humble.
Yeah.
To say, and not to be ashamed. That's not helping. To be humble is not the same thing as to be ashamed. It's to say, wow, okay, I'm really grateful. This is what I tell people. If nothing else, you can say, thank you. I really appreciate you bringing that to my attention because I really care about these issues, right? Yeah. That's it. You just appreciate that someone had the courage to tell you. And it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good to be called racist or sexist or homophobic or any of those things. But we've been asleep too long on all of these issues. And it's sometimes, if someone has to shake you to wake you up, that's what happens. And you don't attack the person who's trying to wake you up. Right. You go, wow, I must have been sleeping really deeply that you had to throw water on me to wake me up. Right. Or give me the smelling salts or whatever the things are. It's being more kind to ourselves, actually, to say, okay, this hard thing was said to me. I made this big mistake and I'm still a good person. That's really where the rub is. But who needs to model that? It's the people with privilege, right? I talk about my privilege when it comes to gender identity, right? I talk about that because I am a queer woman of color from a low income background. It's important for me to talk about my privilege because then everybody can exhale a little bit and go, oh, she has privilege too.
Right. Yeah. And again, it's serving the we and not polarizing. Everything you just said is sounds like balm on a wound. It's lovely. I'm stunned. I read a stat that in 2017 in Canada, we like to say we're different than Americans, as if, the Underground Railroad came here, and so there's no racism here. In 2017, only half of Canadians believed racism was a serious problem. That's not a lot of people. And I think what we do is we have this idea, we're multicultural, we say, but what we're talking about is food and dance and music. But not these issues, not these harder issues. And I almost wonder, just give me your take on this, whether that label of, we're multicultural kind of whitewashes the inherent white supremacy that's built into the system, into the foundation of the system, which we're seeing reflected all over the place now with the genocide of Indigenous people and the bodies being found at residential schools. I mean, it's kind of like Canadians, you cannot keep sleeping this way. So I know I went all over the place there, but I wonder, do you see multiculturalism possibly as a way of sort of avoiding coming to terms with some of these things?
Well, I think we get really caught up on words. There's always a
Yeah.
new word, there's always a new phrase. So I talk a lot about how I joke that I worked at Stanford and students will challenge you on everything from Wikipedia to their mom's dissertation, and you'll spend all day arguing about words. So I have metaphors and things that I use for these different concepts. But what I tell people is we don't need more definitions, we need more conversations, because we don't know what we mean when we say multicultural, when we say racist, when we say white supremacy. People don't know what we mean, and so then they run, roughshod over critical race theory because they're all up in arms because they don't actually know what it is, right? And so everything, it just doesn't matter what the moment is, right? It's multiculturalism, it's critical race theory, it's cultural competence, it's whatever it is, because there was a time where multiculturalism was also controversial, where it was also considered super progressive to even talk about that. I think, though, to what your point actually is, absolutely, there is this sort of kumbaya thing that we want to do that sort of looks at interpersonal, but doesn't look at institutional.
Yeah.
And that's what I think the problem is. I tell people we love to talk about prejudice, so we don't have to talk about oppression, because everybody's prejudiced, but not everybody has been historically marginalized and oppressed, right? And there's a reason why women still don't get paid as much as men across the world. And it has to do with the history of not being able to vote, not being able to work, not being able to own property. These institutional underpinnings have to do with the economic disparity. And that's the difference. When we talk about Black Lives Matter, we're not talking about interpersonal. We're not talking about which lives matter more than others. We're talking about a history of racism that's embedded in that system. And I think, one of the things I do a lot of work internationally. So Singapore, Ireland, all kinds. So I went to Dublin, Ireland for the first time. And, the people I met with there said, we don't have racism in Dublin. We just, people here, everyone gets along. And I've heard that. You don't know how many places, Germany, you name it, I've heard it. And so that night I went out and I met a Nigerian cab driver. And I asked him, I said, is there racism in Dublin? And he laughed and he was like, yes, here's where you can't get a job. Here's where you get harassed. Here's where you can't get an apartment. And he just listed all the things. So I come back to the audience the next day and I said, and I told them about him. And he said I could tell the story. And I said, I've been here one night. And I can tell you about racism in Dublin, and you've lived here your whole life and you can't. Why is that? And the reason is because I asked, right? Because I asked, because I'm a member of the community, and I didn't just sort of come in and say, everything's okay, right?
Assume.
Right? I didn't assume. And, I saw this interview with someone the other day, and he was talking about how growing up, he lived in a multicultural neighborhood. And as far as he could tell, everybody was happy. And he learned later in his life that his friends just didn't trust him to tell him what the negative things were, because, we come from a long history, Black people in this country, of it not being safe to tell anybody. You can't complain at your job, you'll lose your job. You can't complain about racism at your job. So if you don't complain about racism in your job, people don't believe it's racist. Right? In your school, and you'll get bad grades if you complain at your school, right? You'll be labeled a troublemaker if you complain in your spiritual center, right? Oh, she's out race. You remember the race card? She's always talking about race. Now, the only difference is now you have more white people talking about race. So it's kind of hard to just call it the race card, but they're still calling it that. And it's like, when Barack Obama got elected in the US, people were talking about we're post-racial. Now, Black people never thought we were post-racial because we know the difference between individual, interpersonal, and institutional. He wasn't going to come in and in one term or two terms or 10 terms dismantle systems of racism that have been built over centuries. So,
yeah. And you talk about safety and trust, such vital pieces of the foundation. And yet the examples of excessive force by people in power, I mean, it's not just the police, it's the healthcare system, it's doctors, it's nurses, the banking system, the justice system. I mean, it goes on and on. What changes would you like to see? I'm really hearing the strong call for all of us to change internally so that things will change externally. I totally get that. But I wonder too, if there isn't something we could be doing. I think there's a lot of confusion about what we could be doing to support this, increase this awareness of the excessive force that's being used.
Yeah, I think it's a couple different things. I think awareness is actually the easy part. If nowadays you can't help, it's bombarding you all the
Mhm,
time, all the
mhm,
examples. Um, I do notice one of my barometers for whether I can have a conversation with someone is whether they're able to name anything that's racist. So when we start the conversation, or might be talking about police brutality or something like that, and I will say, okay, is there any example you think of racism in the police? And if they can't say yes, that there's ever been an example, or that they feel uncomfortable being able to talk about that at all, then I know this is not a conversation that's really worth my time and investment, right? Like I've had people argue against, Derek Chauvin, right? And when you can make that kind of argument, then that's not there's some people I'm just not going to invest my
mhm,
time and energy talking to.
mhm.
But I do think, you asked me what I think we can do. We have to collaborate more. We have to join things. It's not individual. That's what we're also worried about, is individually being a good person and saying the right or wrong thing. That's so not the problem, right? It's one of the ways it manifests, but it's not the solution for sure. We have to be talking about policy. We have to be talking about institutions. We have to be talking about education, media. All of us have a place where we can get involved, whether it's our child's school or our radio program, whether it's our spiritual community or whether it's our local politicians. There's always some place we can get involved. And it's just a question of, what is my personal pathway or pathways? Right? Like there's so many little things that I do to raise my awareness. I follow trans and disability rights activists on Twitter
Mhm.
because it raises my awareness of things like, Trans Remembrance Day, where, people are remembering the lives of trans people who have been killed. I wouldn't have known about that, right? Or
Right.
Visibility Day or different things like that. But it's just, tapping into a pipeline. So then if I post a job, folks who follow me because I repost things that they post, now I'm creating opportunity for people, which is the reason why I had 4 trans staff people in my 5 years at Stanford, is because I was actively involved in participating in that community and showing up in hiring people you knew you could get a job with
Mhm,
me,
mhm.
right? And those kinds of things, being out front and then building communities. This is the problem. We need to be building things. We're so worried about our own image. We're so worried about other people and what they think. We need to be building things. And I think this was sort of why people got so uncomfortable with defund and, eliminate, ban, like, abolish the police, right? Because these are people who've been in this fight for a long time. And they're saying this is a moment where we're not just going to all watch the videos and wring our hands. We're actually going to change things. And that conversation needs a lot of strategy. Instead of people just shaking their head and go, oh no, that's a bad idea. What are peace officers look like? What does that look like? And how can we be involved? And instead of just going, I don't know what to do, there's so many people trying to figure that out, right? And there's so many people around the world whose policing is about peace. There's
Right.
all these examples that we could use. And if you're involved in that, if you've seen it demonstrated, how can you be involved in bringing those principles to communities that are trying to figure that out? Right? There's 1,000 things really, and
Right.
just about all those things you named in economics and criminal justice. There's 1,000 places to enter the conversation, but the conversation is not about your individual behavior. It's not just about your interpersonal interactions, that whether they make you a good or bad person. This is about systems, and we have to have a systemic view, and we can't take on the system individually, which is why we feel so exhausted. It's like,
Right.
what can I do to make a change? Nothing by yourself. Well, not nothing,
Yeah.
you can vote and
Yeah.
all those things, but you have to join with other like-minded people, and they're out there creating things. And when you get involved in that, well, now you're going to feel more efficacy. You're going to feel like you made a difference because you see other people with you and what you can create as a
Mhm,
collective. which is why spiritual community is so important,
Yeah.
right? I remember bringing these conversations up early when I first went into ministerial school some 7 years ago. And I remember having an instructor who said, there's, politics don't belong in the church. And I said, well, if that was true, you and I wouldn't be sitting in the same room together, right? Because that's how integration happened, right? It's through the churches. And Gandhi says, of course, if you think politics has nothing to do with religion, then you don't know what religion is, right?
Spheres of influence. But, in everything you're saying, I'm really hearing that the conversation and being okay not knowing what to do, but talking about that, asking the questions, listening, being present, all those things are, no matter what portal we enter here, I'm hearing that response from you as being so, so vital. I wonder if we could dive into what you're going to be offering in your 5-week course, because I think anyone who's listening to this would be excited to understand how, because it will be personal. It will be a personal action plan that they will develop, right? I think you even offer, Gabriella, your assistant, said a project. They're going to work on a project, which is just so exciting. So it's a 5-week training online, starts July 8th, called Develop Your Personal Action Plan for Achieving Racial Justice Through Allyship and Solidarity.
Yes.
What's the most powerful tool that you're going to kind of
It's a
include in
laddering.
that? Okay.
It's a laddering. I think you have to know who you are and be willing to explore that, because wherever you go on this journey, you're going to come with you. And so you have to be willing to explore, what do I believe? Where did those beliefs come from? What makes me uncomfortable? How do I push past the things that make me uncomfortable? Where's my resistance in this? So certainly a big part of it is going to be knowing yourself. But we also need to take a look at our environment. What are the things that we care about? What is, as you said, our sphere of influence? I like to have people start with the low-hanging fruit. What can I do tomorrow, right? What's easy for me to get involved with? Where can I see that I can make a difference right away? Because that's actually what gets you sustained in the work. And then I think linking, as I said, to existing efforts. We're always trying to recreate the wheel when there's so much out there that's worked or is working or is being developed that would really excite us and needs our energy. I can't tell you how many of the people who are working on these issues just wish that some newer people would show up, and that it's not always the same people and they're not always preaching to the choir, as it were. The project is optional, but I do think, so I feel like there's a mix of people. There's a group of people who get it, but really want to learn more about some of these concepts, like privilege, like inclusive mindset, and we'll have that. Then there's a group of people who are like, I feel like I'm pretty well educated and I want to act, right? And so it'll be a combination of those things, looking at the core concepts, because those are important. There are some people who go out and act without really having a good understanding of the landscape, and then they're frustrated when the actions aren't well received or effective. So it's going to be both, a little bit of those principles, but also really having people think through, what are possible actions that have impact and what are the right ones for me to take from where I sit. And then of course, integrated through all of that is the spiritual piece, right? Because again, if you sort of think of the fire triangle thing, it's like, what about the fire makes me feel, and what about the heat makes me feel uncomfortable? Let's take a look at that and just see if I can take a breath. We talk about breathing a lot in consciousness, right? Okay, take a breath and see if I can get more comfortable with what makes me uncomfortable here. And then that fuel is, what are the things around me that I already care about, that I'm already passionate about? I always tell people the thing that's killing the planet is killing the people. It's that same obsession with control and, being able to take resources from other people or from the planet. It's the same energetic. And so the same tools that you might use in that effort are similar. Let's look at environmental racism. If you're, passionate about the environment, environmental racism might be the thing where you start, right? And then one of the things we're going to do is visioning. And when I ask people, what is your vision of justice? Just close your eyes and tell me what your vision of justice is. Most of us don't have one. You
What's your
can't get
vision
there,
of justice?
right? You can't get there if you don't know where you're going, right?
Yeah.
And I love King's quote about, love in action, right? It's it's like when we are really allowed, right? Really allowed, given permission and space and freedom to operate from a place of love. For me, that's justice, right? When everyone is allowed, given permission and freedom and space, right? To operate from a place of love. Because there's this false belief that we have that some people don't want that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there are these layers of confusion that people have had. We're all afraid, in our spiritual philosophy, we say the only evil is the belief in separation from God, right? It's just a confusion that we're separate from that divine energy, whatever name you call it. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
attached to that at all. And because we think we can be separated from that, of course we can be separated from people, right? If
Mm-hmm.
you're separated with your divine source, right? So that uh, it's just to be revealed that there really is not this line that we think there is, but there is oppression. And so that is where it gets tricky for folks, is like going, what does it look like to rid ourselves, our societies of oppression, right? And operate from a place of love.
Right.
That's the creativity that's required in
Right.
this moment.
Right. And will it be interactive? What will the format be? Because I know it's 5 weeks and it's 9 to 10:30 Pacific
Yeah.
Standard Time, but then recorded. So if people can't make that time, they can watch it later.
Absolutely.
But those who are live, is there an interactive element or how will
Yes.
that work?
Absolutely. So I kind of don't like to do anything that's static. I love to talk. It's what I do for a living, but I find it more interesting when people are engaging with the concepts. So we have a number of activities. Visioning is one of them. We'll do a libation, calling in the ancestors. We'll invite people through the project to have opportunities to interact. I always do something, visual with slides and different things, give you a chance to think about your identities, give you a chance to think about how you define different words, to grapple with the concepts. So it's always pretty interactive. So I'm excited about the last course we taught. I think even the online space on Facebook that people had, really, really rich conversation. So I'm excited to see what unfolds now that we're in a really different depth of the conversation in our society. So looking forward
Mm-hmm.
to seeing who shows up.
And will there be, just in terms of creating a safe container, because this is a deep dive into self, and so safety there too would be important. I'm
Yes.
wondering if you can touch on that.
Yeah. We have a model that we talk about. We want to create spaces that are safe and brave, right? So we talk about a safe space, which is an important thing, and people need a comfort zone. But we're going to push. We're going to push people out of their comfort zone into their learning edge. But we do want people to take care of themselves and not be in the danger zone, in the place where they actually feel unsafe or threatened. But I always ask people to calibrate the difference between being unsafe and being uncomfortable.
Right.
Because a lot of times we like to shut down these conversations the second we feel uncomfortable, when we're actually not truly unsafe. So no one can know. I really respect that. I don't know for people what their danger zone is. I don't know your history. I don't know what happened for you earlier today. So I invite people to take care of themselves, take a breath, take a break, or to speak up if they feel like something has happened that's made the space unsafe. But more often than not, I find that it's the discomfort that really we're worried about making ourselves unsafe. And that, I did research on the class I taught at Stanford, and we found that people learn the most when they were the most uncomfortable.
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting. Wow. Huh. Okay, so I think we were almost at time. Love talking to you. I want to
We
ask
do
you
have,
the
Tasha, if I
question.
may, we do
What
have
is,
about we do have about 10 more minutes. So that's great. And I love what you said about, well, everything specifically. I'm just sitting here fascinated because I can relate to some of the things that you've been speaking about. And a big part of me was coming up as, as a privileged white guy, which I was like, what do you mean? When this language started coming out, I was confused because I didn't see it. I wasn't understanding. And it was about a year or so ago when conversations were happening that I realized, oh, and now, what you're saying is exactly where I'm at. Like, what do I do? And part of it's paralyzed, part of it's been uncomfortable. So I can very, very much relate from my world exactly what you're saying. I've been taking notes. So what can I do? And I'm really quite excited, but I just want to say that you do have a little bit more time.
Okay, thank you.
I did want to ask you what your vision is. Let's start ending on a positive note, because I'm sure you have one, and I know you're very committed to holding it. Do you really, really believe that we can have peace and equity? Is that part of what you're holding in your vision?
This is going to sound interesting for folks, but it's part of my spiritual practice. We have peace and equity, right? It is actually the natural way of things. I think people think discord and disharmony and oppression is natural, but the reason why it keeps being challenged is because it's unnatural. Hatred is unnatural. Love is actually the nature of things, right? The growth, the freedom of things is actually the natural way. We are perverting it because of this dissociation we have from our own divinity. And, if you want to get really, really deep in my ministry, I talk a lot about the divine feminine and the loss of that balance, right, in our world. And that when we look back on this period of history, we're going to talk about it as the time when, God was a warmongering white man, right? And that is, part of it's just a grave imbalance in the images that we need to see. And so in my mind, I always think of it as it's not a future thing. It's not a thing I'm striving for or working for, or certainly not struggling for. It is the reality, and I'm just revealing it. I'm just uncovering. It's like there's a huge difference between thinking that you're climbing to get somewhere,
right,
and thinking that you're wiping away layers of, dirt that are covering something that's already whole and exists. And so that's actually how I think about peace and equity and justice, is that it's natural. So it's actually I find that the greatest insights happen when you can show people the goodness in themselves, right? And what we're struggling here with when we talk about white supremacy is the idea that I can face all of these horrible things that happened and still love myself. That's the hardest part right now. And I think for people who have been marginalized and oppressed, there's a righteous impatience that's like, get it together. Like, we don't have time to wait. Like, now you see. If you didn't know before, now you see we are dying at the hands of inaction. Literally dying, literally raising our children in fear at the hands of inaction. So doing nothing is not an option, which is why the focus of this course is helping people figure out what is my first next step, right? So that's my vision, is that we just kind of wipe away the cobwebs that are keeping us from seeing who we really are. Because when you see who you really are, like really, really are, it's so much easier to know that that is true for everyone else, not just some people. I just don't really engage in the conversation of trying to teach people who don't want to hear my voice who they are. But what I know is when the people around me, right, and the people around them, and the people who do want to have this conversation really stand in who we are, or sit in who we are, or be in who we are, that changes everything.
And it leads you, I mean, what you said about the reality of peace and equity being here now, I think saying it in those words, what struck me was I would tune in to when I didn't feel peace in the present moment and do something different, right? Because if you're saying it's always here, it's always available, it's not in the future, it's right now, then it becomes a barometer of your own individual work and how you keep assessing where you are and what you're saying, what you're seeing, what you're doing, like all of it. and use it as a way to come back to that connected, bigger part of self.
That's the oxygen piece, right?
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
to keep something in front of you. It's kind of like if you go out in nature, right? If you love nature and you go out in nature, you have this moment where you realize that whatever busyness and chaos is going on where you are, it's not, the ocean is still there. The mountains are still there.
Right.
The quiet is still there, right? It's not gone because it's so busy in our lives, right? We just have to go to it. And that's how I think about peace or justice, or we just have to go to it. And it's there. We don't celebrate transformation in our society. We don't celebrate the Klan. There's a story of after Charlottesville, 1 year later, a white supremacist who was a leader in the Klan got baptized in a creek by a black minister and renounced his membership in the Klan. Nobody's telling that story, but they should be.
Yeah.
That's the story. We're not talking about the transformation that's happening every day. So we doubt that it's happening, but it's happening every day. I feel really blessed to work in a field where I get to watch people have the aha moment, and I get to watch people challenge structural racism in the workplace and in the spiritual communities. It's beautiful, but you've got to be around people who are telling that story.
Right. Well, we're at time now. And again, for everyone, I know we have links on consciousliving.radio.org, also on the Shift Network. And is there another website or something that you want to say that for them to register? Where are they registering?
I think it's fine. They can use your website or the Shift Network, and we're just proud to be a partner with you and with them, and just looking forward to seeing folks show up.
So that starts July 8th, a very important 5 weeks where you can develop your personal action plan for achieving racial justice through allyship and solidarity. Oh, and I think there's a talk that you did that's available right now,
Yes.
also on the website, an hour talk, Envisioning a Racially Just World. So if you want more and just to get a sense of where you're at and whether you want to do this 5 weeks, go listen to the talk. I think it's really inspiring too.
Awesome.
Thank
Awesome.
you
Thank
so
you
much
for
for joining
having
us
me.
today.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Wonderful.
Bye.
Bye. We've been speaking with Dereca Blackmon about so many important things. But again, July 8th, find the information on the website, develop your personal action plan for achieving racial justice through allyship and solidarity.